All right, it's a couple minutes after 9, so maybe we will get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole Cork. I'm the Association Manager of iHEA's activities. Welcome and thank you for registering for today's webinar, which is hosted by the Immunization Economics Special Interest Group. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes and will be recorded and uploaded on our website afterwards. Before we begin the webinar, I just wanted to run through a couple of housekeeping items. If you do experience any technical issues during the webinar, please write them in the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and I'll be happy to assist. Everyone on the line has been muted except for the speakers in an effort to eliminate background noise. So if you do have any questions or comments during the webinar, please use the chat box. I'm now going to pass it over to our iHEA past president, David Bishai, to introduce today's speaker.
Thank you, Nicole. My name is David Bishai, and it gives me great pleasure to be presenting this speaker for our webinar. This is co-sponsored by the Immunization Economics Interest Group, and Chris Lahim and Stephen Resch are on to just say a couple words about the Special Interest Group and put some links in the chat box. Why don't you go ahead, Steve?
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm just putting in the chat box some links you can follow if you're interested in joining the SIG or learning about our activities. There's a link for you there. I also put the link to our past iHEA meeting materials. If you want to look at that, all the presentations from our 2-day pre-Congress session are up there as well. And I put the Twitter and Facebook for those of you who are into that sort of thing as well. If you want to stay tuned. We have a frequent newsletter that goes out about no less than every 2 months. And it's a good way to stay in touch with issues that are at the intersection of immunization and economics. Thank you.
Yes, please do that and send us ideas for more webinars. I know that Shrina Malavi and I are thinking about a webinar on COVID vaccine from the receiving countries' point of view, from low and middle income countries on the economics of financing and paying for it. So love to get your ideas for what you would like to hear about immunization economics. Well, moving on, I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Craig Roberts. Craig is an Associate Vice President in the Center for Observation on Real World Evidence, also known as CORE at Merck. In his role there, he leads a research team that is conducting observational research studies to characterize the public health and economic burden of vaccine preventable diseases. They use data and apply models and do what economists do with vaccines. And it's especially timely right now as all of the world is literally holding its breath waiting for this vaccine. So I'll turn it over to Craig. He'll speak, and you can put in your comments in the chat box at any time, but I think we'll confine our answers to the questions till the end of his comments. So you're on, Craig.
Great, thank you so much, David, and I'm very happy to be here to be able to speak to this group. Just as setting the stage for it, I don't have any magic special data that no one else has seen. I'm working with the same data that everyone else has at the time. And so a lot of this presentation, I will be presenting ideas and data, but more translating them to what do they mean about the future, and what can we expect from a future when vaccines are available. So I'm going to get right into it, and I am really interested in the questions that folks have, and I'm sure other folks are interested in the types of questions that people have. I have 4 basic sections of this presentation. First, I'm going to reflect a little on the recent past with what does this mean for health economists, what does this mean for researchers. Then I'm going to get into future vaccines, what might they look like, and how can we think about what's about to happen with regard to vaccine availability? And I'll punctuate some of these examples with our experience, particularly from Ebola vaccine and how that went for us and some of the complexities associated with that. Then I'll describe future disease considerations. So when there is a vaccine, what might this disease look like, and how does that affect how we think about vaccines of the future? And then I'll marry those 2 ideas and say, what does that mean first for health economists, and secondly, just in general for everyone. So to start with this, a little reflection on the recent past. And I want to start by talking about this whole idea of the broader value of prevention, the broader value of disease. There's been a lot of great literature in the vaccines area and in the pharmaceuticals area about thinking about broader health impacts of disease and therefore the broader health benefits of treatments. To the left of this slide shows great work, Mark Chitt, Raymond Dubesi, and others, on an article that characterized the state of research in impacts beyond just health that vaccines can have through ecological effects, macroeconomic effects, impact on education and future workforce, etc. We're in such a unique space because never has it been more clear how impactful a disease can be than what we are experiencing right now. So there is a lot of opportunity, for lack of better word, to think through how methodology might be developed through understanding this and how we can characterize just the massive impact that this has had so far. Because I think it is very important to be able to document the broad economic impact of this disease to support all the investment needed in continuing research to prevent the next pandemic and to further invest in increasing our preparedness. To the right of that figure is what has been called the value flower, which came out of some work of an ISPOR interest group. And it also proposes a broad spectrum of additional economic impacts. And I was going through this flower, just reading through each one of them, thinking about COVID, and practically all of them are in full force right now when we think either about the impact of COVID-19 or the way that we think about the interventions that are put in place. And I want to highlight one specifically, which is real option value, because I see it coming up in the media, just in public discourse around social distancing, but not necessarily articulated from an economist point of view. Social distancing is buying people time. It's allowing people to not get infected and slowing down the rate of infection so that we can learn more about how to treat this serious disease. And it also buys time for new treatments such as remdesivir and probably a series of monoclonal antibodies and other therapies. So if there ever were a case for talking seriously about the power of real option value, it's the importance, it's part of the economic value of social distancing and right now, allowing people to benefit from future therapies. And one could do a similar thought exercise for all of the other elements of value presented there. And these ideas, I think they're important because they are starting to get a lot of broad attention to thinking bigger about the impacts of disease and therapies on value, as reflected in WHO recent guide for standardization of economic evaluation of immunization programs that came out in October of last year, which recognizes these broader impacts, and the second panel on cost effectiveness in health and medicine, which also includes a discussion of these broader impacts. So I did a little thinking with my team, and this is just an example. It's by no means comprehensive, but how does this kind of play out? And if we think of like a first order, second order, third order effect, when I think about a lot of diseases, it starts to get hazy once you get 2 or 3 steps away. In this case, we could keep going further and further, and I'll use this as an example. We start with a symptomatic infection. All of the direct stuff, very clear, very obvious. Outpatient, inpatient costs, healthcare resource utilization, impact on productivity and quality of life. There is some discussion of long-term sequelae associated with severe COVID-19, and of course the excess mortality and spread of infection. We can expand this further, that the impact on the health system is such that we're exceeding healthcare capacity in several places, particularly New York City right now. Excess risk to healthcare workers, potential excess mortality in healthcare workers, which further constrains healthcare capacity, and poorer quality care for other conditions. One of the other things we've seen noted is particular risks to first responders in the U.S. And the significant impact that that's having. Spread of infection leading to social distancing, drop in economic activity, increased unemployment, disruption of education, social isolation, reports of concerns around domestic violence, which is terrible. And then we see people deferring healthcare. We've seen a notable drop in routine immunization. So decrease in prevention, which is, if that's not corrected, is going to catch up with us eventually in measles outbreaks, and decreased screening, including decreases in cancer screening, and unexplained excess mortality, possibly non-COVID related in areas that are hardest hit. And you can keep going on and on, fiscal stimulus, government deficits, and all the consequences. It will be an interesting exercise to try to articulate how broad-based the economic impact of this pandemic has been. So to close out this first section, this is probably the best example in history so far of the broad impact that a disease can have on modern society. And I think it is important to document and explore these costs as they continue to develop, because it will be important to continuing to communicate how important it is for us to continue to innovate and develop technologies that can rapidly respond to pandemic threats. So that's my reflection on the past. Of course, we can't prevent what has already happened. So now we have to think about, well, what does the future look like? And in particular, what are the what's the future look like for vaccines? So this came from an article that I really enjoyed, just graphically describing how a lot of different vaccines work. It's probably 3 weeks old now, which in COVID time is practically ancient. There are many more than even 100 vaccines in development at this point. But what's fascinating about this is how many technologies in vaccines we have available and are putting in force to try to develop against this particular virus. This could not have happened 20 years ago. This is there's a lot of new technologies here, and it just goes to the power of innovation and where this science is today. And the first ones to jump out of the gate are new ideas, rather new ideas, nucleic acid vaccines, such as Moderna's RNA-based platform. And it's not a surprise that they're the first ones out, because it's this type of platform that allows you to quickly go from the sequence, which was posted in January, to an actual vaccine product. And these platforms so far do not have a marketed vaccine. They're that new, but they do hold a lot of promise, and we will learn a lot about them as they go through the development process for this particular disease. So it's we've never seen anything even close to this, with so many different types of vaccines being developed in such rapid time into humans and studied in parallel. So it's really hard to predict exactly what's going to happen, but I think we can feel really good about the science that's going on and what we have to work with. I took a draft. It was the May 5th version of the WHO landscape. They keep a tracker of all the different vaccines in development, and I put it up against historic transition probabilities from an article that looked at different types of vaccines. In this case, I used their pandemic influenza transition probabilities just as an example. And also it's not quite as clear cut, because the development process, which I'll show, is not going from preclinical 1, 2, 3 traditionally, but bear with me and you'll see where I'm going with this. If we assume we have 100 preclinicals right now, and there's probably more, about historically, 14% of those would make it to phase 1. We have at least 6 of what we could call phase 1 candidates. So 14 plus 6, a third of which historically would make it to phase 2. We have definitely Moderna is approved for phase 2, and some would argue another for phase 2. That gives us 8. About half of those make it to phase 3, which would be 4. And most of what makes it through phase 3 does get registered. So this looks better and better every day. And I think it is not overly optimistic to expect that we will have a number of successful vaccines by, if not by early 2021, by late 2021. What I hope we don't forget when the dust settles on all of this is that most of these probably will fail. Historically, most investments and most innovation in the space fails. So we should get a few successful vaccines to work with, and there will be a lot that probably will not succeed. This is a great article about how long it will take and why we expect that things can go faster. The authors of this were from CEPI, and I overlaid in what they call their traditional paradigm, the traditional timeline, which came from the also this pandemic influenza development article. Historically, it would take about 8.5 years to develop a vaccine in this case. And usually what you would do as a manufacturer is you'll try to figure out how to make it in parallel across those 8 years. Because manufacturing is a very difficult process, and it's a very time-consuming process, a capital-intensive process for the vaccine industry. And what companies try to do is we try to have our manufacturing figured out, scale commercial manufacturing, by the time we finish phase 3 and then do some lot comparisons of the investigational product to the commercial product, then we're ready to file. Well, things are different here. And this illustration in this article tells really what's going on right now. Companies are going very fast into humans. They're mixing phase 1 and phase 2, so getting dose selection together at the same time with important safety data. And then they will go into a phase 2/3, doing further safety evaluation and efficacy, immunogenicity all at the same time. So it is also realistic to expect that can happen a whole lot faster, as we're seeing. So it's not unrealistic to expect vaccines by 2021. But one of the most important parts here, which I think is going to play out in the future, is this mismatch here between setting up large-scale manufacturing and completing study of the safety and efficacy of products. And this is where this looks a whole lot like what our experience was with Ebola. When we at Merck took on the Ebola vaccine, it had already finished the preliminary safety and dose selection phase, and the outbreak in West Africa was happening. So working with WHO, who was just an extremely valuable partner in the Ebola response and development, they set up a clinical trial, a phase 3 study, to use our vaccine in responding to the West Africa outbreak. And that all went very well. That data were useful for the filing and eventual approval of the vaccine. But we didn't have manufacturing figured out yet. We started a brand new manufacturing facility in Germany that was dedicated to the production of this vaccine. And it takes a long time to set it up. And what happened was another outbreak happened, the outbreak in DRC in Congo, which is going on now. And this new outbreak happened before we had our manufacturing fully figured out. So we had to respond to that by taking our clinical trial supplies, which are small batch. It's a process that's meant for making small batches. We had to respond to the DRC through a clinical trial protocol using clinical supplies while we were trying to set up large-scale manufacturing. And at a point, we were being asked for more, and didn't have it. So what ended up at one point in the middle of this response, we had drug product in Germany and did not have the machinery, the physical stuff, the physical machinery to fill it. We called on BARDA, who reached out to the US Air Force to basically airlift product from Germany to the US to allow us to hook that product up to the machines that fill the vials so that we can then ship that back to Africa. So manufacturing is such an extremely important part of this whole puzzle. And while we will be able to realistically have vaccines proven safe and effective in a rather short time, I would anticipate that the scale up of manufacturing and the ability to supply product is going to be a big stress on the system for an extended period of time, probably through emergency use and compassionate use protocols. And that's something I think we have to think about with regard to supply and demand. Companies are thinking about it. And I started to, this is a small subset of what has probably been 50 or 60 media announcements so far of massive pre-investments in manufacturing. So all of the major companies have at some point put some press release around literally hundreds of millions to billions of dollars of pre-investment in manufacturing before they even have a product in humans. And that's a testament to how we're recognizing how hard it is to get manufacturing to scale. And the only real way to try to do this is to start building and start investing in the capital and the physical machinery while you're still trying to develop the clinical product and study the clinical product. I wanted to do this as a table to tabulate how much money. It's not quite possible to do because it's not quite clear how much is being spent, but you quickly realize that it's billions with a B at the beginning and an S at the end. Literally billions of at-risk manufacturing investment is happening right now across the industry, and also contributing quite a bit from the public sector. So this is my prediction on the first section. I do think we will have multiple vaccines. I think they might be first generation vaccines. And I think this is important when we think about how would we apply models and think about how to use future vaccines, because they're going to be different from one another. And one of the key differences is they will probably vary on effectiveness, specifically in the hardest group to vaccinate, which is older adults. By far, age is the most important risk factor of this disease, particularly age over 70 and age over 80. In older adults also, it's more difficult to get a robust immune response through immunization for older adults. So I would expect if we have multiple vaccines, they will probably vary to the extent to which they can protect older adults, and that will play into how we figure out how best to use this vaccine to protect the public. They will probably vary in durability of protection. Expect vaccines to cost different amounts. The cost of manufacture and the scalability of vaccines could vary substantially. Number of doses, reactogenicity, the ability to protect individuals, and the time of availability. And I bring this up because I think in the beginning, when we have a few vaccines and we're struggling with supply, we need to figure out how to use everything we have to the best possible way that we can. And I think that will require a lot of modeling of different profiles used different ways to protect different segments of the population. Because not everything will probably be as effective as we would like for the highest risk group, which are older adults. So for this second section, my conclusion is we have a tremendous wave of innovation, and it is likely, I think, that we will see numerous vaccines by the end of 2021. It's possible, if not likely, that these vaccines will look quite a bit different from one another, particularly with regard to efficacy and durability and administration. And maybe this is a first wave of first generation vaccines, and we will want to see them get used. We will want to use them the best, but we'll probably want to continue to see innovation in this space to continue to improve upon the prior, to improve upon this set of vaccines. And traditionally, vaccines are, I mean, medicines as well, are each new product learns from the failures of the past. And in this case, we can't really do that since everything is happening in parallel. So that's what I think about vaccines. Now let's think about the disease. When I ask people internally, what is the biggest concern that we have across all of our vaccines as far as running it as a business and running it effectively? The consistent response I get is we have a lot of trouble figuring out future demand. And because the manufacturing takes so long to set up and run, we end up with mismatches between supply and demand, and it takes a while to correct those mismatches. So I wanted to reflect a little bit on what is this disease going to look like, not today, but when a vaccine is finally available, whenever it's finally available. So I want to specifically focus on two pieces of data. One is how many people will have been infected by the time a vaccine is available. And second, if infected, how long are they protected? And either by nature, by prior infection of the virus, or through protection by the vaccine, so durability of immunity. And to orient you to this, the supply, T equals 0 is whenever a vaccine happens to be available. You know, however long it takes. So the T equals 0 on these hypothetical graphs are when a vaccine is available. And you'll notice that all the supply curves look exactly the same because everybody is building as much as they can, as fast as they can, without any regard to what the disease is at present. But we could end up with some orders of magnitude difference in demand based on just two unknowns of the disease, which are how fast is this going to spread over the next 12 to 18 months, and how long are people protected? If we start at the upper right corner, you know, if we have setbacks, if we're not as fast as we want to be, and if society loses patience and social distancing and this virus is left to spread, we could have a situation where it outpaces us. And this has happened in, I think of Zika, for example, where the susceptible pool was essentially exhausted as vaccines were trying to be developed. It's not unrealistic that could possibly happen in this case. Many people think that's unlikely, but I have to put it out there. Then we go to the left. Whether or not infection leads to long-term immune response, or whether people can get reinfected and thus may even need to be revaccinated depending on the vaccine, can have a considerable impact on the long-term demand. And I do foresee that there will be a whole lot of stress in this significant mismatch between supply and demand, both in the short term where there's not enough supply, but there's also a whole lot of risk being taken on not knowing what the long-term demand is. So I want to take that these two ideas around uncertainty and risk and preparation, and then build on them a little bit. So first, how many people have been infected? I think the short answer is we're not really sure, but we are getting a lot more information from which to guess that. And one thing, you know, we see and hear about a lot is that a large portion of infections are asymptomatic. or low symptoms. And there've been a few really good studies of this. I'm showing a couple. One was a population-based study of infection in Italy at 2 time points, covered a large portion of the population of a city. And what they found in this study was over 40% of infected individuals were asymptomatic. Some may have gone on to have symptoms later, but infected individuals were asymptomatic. And then the Diamond Princess cruise ship, which sat off of Japan for a while at the beginning of all of this, everyone was tested. 17% were infected, 50% were asymptomatic, and some of those as well may have gone on to have symptoms. But it does look like people are settling on the idea that around 30 to 40% of infected individuals are asymptomatic. So the case counts that we're seeing are just by definition undercounts. There's been a lot of discussions around the need for seroprevalence studies, looking at how many people have antibodies so we can understand how many people have already been infected. There's also a lot of criticism of these studies as they've been done early on based on the quality of tests and non-random sampling. But when we compare the seroprevalence study to reported cases at the time, you consistently see pretty vast underreporting if that seroprevalence represents the population infection rate, tenfold or more underreporting of the cases as a proxy for how many people are actually infected. So there probably have been quite a number of individuals infected, and we need some multiplier to estimate that at this point, and hopefully many more seroprevalence studies to understand that. So that brings me to the first. I'm going to show 2 models that, but the first model to look at around this, and this is the Imperial College model. I'll tell a little personal story. My wife actually sent me the PDF of this report that came out March 16th, just a day after it was released and was picked up in the media. And she's not in healthcare. It was literally the first time in 20 years I had talked to her about an infectious disease model, and for at least 2 or 3 days at home, I was quite a star for knowing all this stuff. That got old pretty quickly, but anyhow, to the cultural impact of this model cannot be overstated. No, I'm not going to talk about the numbers or projections or anything like that, but I want to make a point. This was a very bold thing to do, and I really appreciate the work by this group for really bringing together the public dialogue on what we were facing and how we needed to approach it. And when I look at this model that I'm sure many people have seen, if not everyone on this call, thinking about it from the perspective of a vaccine, I'm looking at this and thinking, well, what's this going to look like? What if we have a vaccine here, or you know, how many waves of disease are we going to see, and how successful are we going to be at trying to manage it such that we can protect people by vaccine? So I think this, in a world where many modelers won't even dare project more than 4 weeks, to see a group be so bold as to project this out for multiple years is really important and very useful as we think about how we manage people in the longer term in the future world. And that's what I think vaccine folks are going to need more of, and more refined with more contemporary data as we go forward. And the general thinking of this is there are going to be a lot of people who will still benefit from vaccines around the timeline that vaccines will be available. So that's first question. How many people will have been infected? Don't really know, but there probably will be a lot of susceptible individuals at the time of the vaccine. The second question is, once infected, how long are people protected? And there's a couple pieces of data we can draw upon. Natural coronaviruses, endemic coronaviruses that cause the common cold, do appear to infect people multiple times. There have been a couple challenge studies that show within a year you can be infected either with a different strain or a same strain. In some cases, the second infection a year later is less severe. I'm showing a couple panels from a study that was put online. It's not a peer-reviewed study, although the primary study was peer-reviewed. This is a sub-analysis from it. And it looks at coronaviruses, endemic coronaviruses, in a diverse population of, a small population of people in New York. And it shows these 4 viruses coronaviruses that cause cold, and from T equals 0, how quickly people get an infection caused by these viruses. And then the right panel shows reinfection. So for 2 strains, OC43 and HKU1 of these coronaviruses, within a year, people start racking up reinfections, so second infection. So there is pretty good evidence that the less severe coronaviruses do cause multiple infections in people. So immunity does wane. There's also some to be learned from these more severe coronavirus, SARS-CoV-1, the prior SARS, where there have been studies of long-term antibodies. So one study looking at 176 patients of antibodies found that antibodies were maintained for 2 years in individuals that were infected. And they did find some reduction after the 3rd year. And the authors suggested that it might be possible that people could be reinfected greater than 3 years after exposure. A second study, smaller study, but was published maybe last month in medRxiv, looked at long-term persistence of antibodies in a set of healthcare workers, mostly young healthcare workers that were infected with SARS-CoV-1. And they also recruited an additional 20 infected and 40 uninfected to contrast antibodies. And they were able to find neutralizing antibodies for 12 years out from an initial infection. There's some studies small studies with MERS as well. The totality of this data tells us not really sure, not really sure how long people will be protected or if people will be able to get reinfected in the future. So it is this wild card that we just have to live with. Of can people be reinfected? Possibly. Will they get less severe infections a second time? We don't know, and that could affect the extent to which people respond to a vaccine over the long term as well. And that brings me to a second model. I called this the Harvard model. Maybe it's a Harvard model, Mark Lipsitch and his team. And really cool model. They looked at coronaviruses, OC43 and HKU1, which I showed on a prior slide, these less severe coronaviruses, and their kind of the trends going along with them, seasonality, reinfection possibility, and cross immunity. They have some cross immunity to one another, and set up a model that worked with those 2 viruses. And then they dropped in a novel severe coronavirus into that system without any interventions here, and let it do its thing, and worked with some of these different variables. What if immunity only lasts 40 weeks? What if it lasts 2 years? So what if the seasonality is more or less? And what about cross immunity? Again, the numbers in this particular panel don't mean so much. The point of this is there are a whole lot of very different futures depending on a few things we still don't know about SARS-CoV-2, and particularly its seasonality and its the potential for reinfection. This model, by the way, is available on GitHub. So thank you if you know the authors, or if the authors are online. That's a really cool thing to do, and I know a lot of people will benefit from it. But then they go on in this paper to then take this system they've set up, and they parameterize SARS-CoV-2 similar to how the Imperial College model did, and set up these social distancing triggers such that a certain number of cases in the ICU would trigger social distancing, and then when another off trigger, or when the ICUs have more capacity, will we'll pull back on social distancing. And show this under a variety of scenarios. The first two are with current critical care capacity, the second two are with double critical care capacity, and then with more or less seasonal variation, seasonal pressure on the on SARS-CoV-2. And we see a whole lot of very different futures based on unknowns around how this vaccine will behave in the future. And what I was particularly paying attention to, because I'm kind of feeling like we're racing against a clock, is how fast are models expecting infections to accumulate in the community, and where might we be able to have a vaccine and be able to slow this down or have a positive impact on the population. So I think these exercises are really important, and they're going to continue to be important as we have vaccines and we figure out how to use them and understand how they can affect the long-term projection of disease in the future. So conclusions around future of the disease. Some of these are a little bit obvious, sorry about that, but quite a bit more people have been infected than confirmed cases report. And by the time vaccines are available, many more will have been infected. Social distancing has been effective at slowing the disease, and these models have been really important to inform that. I think there is significant uncertainty around the impact of behavior changes between social distancing. Certainly in my community, people are behaving a lot differently. And there's also uncertainty around long-term social acceptance of prolonged social distancing. So we are in a little race with vaccines and this virus. It's kind of unclear right now if face masks are going to be a new fashion statement, or if they're going to be some symbol of oppression, or both, depending on where you are. And there is a significant uncertainty around reinfection risk. And all of this kind of goes together to say there's an extraordinary investment. People are working very hard trying to build up as much as we can, but we really have no reliable information about what long-term need is for vaccine. So we will probably have pretty significant mismatches in the short and long term between supply and demand. Short term, we won't have enough, and long term, we have no idea. So this will go on for an extended period of time. And then to wrap this up with a couple points. For health economists, I think demonstrating the broad economic impact of COVID-19 will be useful to support continued investment in pandemic innovation and vaccine manufacture capacity. And I think that's going to be so critical. We've come a long way, and we need to continue to push the science here with investment. Models are going to be critical to figure out how to optimize what we have under different strategies. Particularly, how will we deploy vaccines? We'd expect to use healthcare providers, of course, and at-risk groups. But if we have vaccines that are better or worse, or have different profiles, we need to find a good way to use everything we have. And I think models will be critical to helping us do that. The number one concern we always have as a manufacturer is trying to figure out demand, not just in the short term, but long-term demand. And it's a perpetual struggle given the complexity of supply to try to marry and match long-term supply with long-term demand needs. And we need to use models to figure that out with that are continuously being updated with new science, what we know about the disease, the spread of the disease, and potential reinfection risk. And then last slide here, what does this mean for use of a vaccine in general? Due to potential sustained mismatch between supply and demand, I think we need extreme alignment across public and private sectors. All of the political pressure when supply becomes available is going to be very strong. We as a supplier and many, all of the other manufacturers recognize this is a global disease, that this is a threat everywhere. I know everyone is partnering up right now to agree on the right approach to risk-based vaccination and vaccine allocation. And I think there needs to be a separation between allocation and pricing, just specifically that that allocation is designed to maximize public health benefit, and it's not associated with whatever group may be able to pay more for vaccine. That's not how we want to go forward. The rapid disclosure of science, it's overwhelming, and it's also very positive through preprint journals, through GitHub postings, through sharing of information. It's going to continue to be critical for everyone to be successful here. And real-time research data sharing on infection rates, risk factors, long-term antibody responses, et cetera, across industry, across the public sector will be crucial to our response. So that's what I have. I think it's going to be a complex path forward. I'm very positive around our ability to have vaccines, and figuring out how to use them will be the next major challenge that we all face.
Thank you very, very much, Craig. Very, very well researched and stimulating presentation. For the audience here, we have about 10 minutes left for questions, and please put some questions in the chat box. So my question is what you've alluded to, is that we can anticipate a possible shortage, and our major tool in other markets is to use the price as the thing that signals suppliers to supply and signals demand to demand. And those mechanisms for adaptation are muted now. We're seeing lots of capital coming to press supply with an uncertain demand. Could you comment on your fears about worst case scenario in this shortage, and what can we as economists do in 2020 to mitigate that worst case supply scenario?
Yeah, I think it's a different situation than anything we've quite faced in the past. And there's a commitment. There are agreements already across industry through IFPMA and public health providers that we want to see equal. We don't necessarily want price to determine where a vaccine goes. We want equitable access. We want an ordered and logical deployment of the vaccine, which would naturally go to highest risk groups first, such as healthcare providers. And I think that's a place where we need a lot of partnership with public health groups such as WHO and other similar partners. I think with regard to pricing, the traditional way of doing this just doesn't work. We often think in terms of value-based pricing because the purchasers, whether it be ACIP, the assessors in the US, or JCVI in the UK, or others, think about cost effectiveness with vaccines, and vaccines have always proven to be very cost effective because we're very mindful of that. When we, as that being the high bar of a price, we wouldn't go above what wouldn't be cost effective for the typical use. In this case, the crisis is so present that the value of value-based price, literally taken, could result in a socially unacceptable or unaffordable price. So we have to think of a different way. I also think there's there could be some mistakes if we go down a path of cost-based pricing, particularly when we don't have scale, because for a few reasons. First, the cost to make something will have no relationship to the particular profile of a vaccine. There'll just be random association between cost and vaccine profile. Also, the costs are so fixed based that it's from a manufacturer, it's as much about volume as it is about a price with regard to trying to manage the cost of goods and the cost of manufacture. that's a place where some advanced market commitments come in as a particular possible way to alleviate some of that stress. So I think there's a lot of reasons why the traditional, a couple more obvious approaches, whether it be a value-based approach or a cost-based approach, don't really work for vaccines. So I think we just have to be reasonable. If there are multiple players, and once we settle out with some of the short-term supply possibilities, I think there will be a healthy market that could come into play. And we want some reasonable association between what a vaccine does and what people are paying for it, and we want to be able to come up with a price that can be affordable in low income settings, which may mean that we need a higher price in high income settings in order to make that possible. So I can't quite answer specifically what that all means. I just recognize that the typical way of doing this all has we need a new way to think about the price and separate that from allocation.
So Mohammed Haq is joining from Tasmania in Australia, and Mohammed, why don't you take yourself off mute to elaborate on your question from an Australian perspective, because you're worried about allocating vaccines across socioeconomic groups. So could you say more about what mechanisms you have in the Department of Health in Australia to protect the poor in your setting?
Hi, everybody. Look, in Australia, it is centrally controlled. So the federal government will probably going to procure most of the vaccine, and they're going to give out to the states to administer them. We also have a mechanism that states can also seek vaccines if they need to, but then again, it has to go through our TGA, TGA, Therapeutic Goods Administration, and that agency actually will have all the numbers, and on that basis, they will buy the vaccines from wherever they need to buy it from, and they're gonna give it out to whichever community that needs it. We don't have that much of a complexity in terms of administering the vaccine. What my question is, the countries that don't actually have a universal health system, what's going to happen to the low socioeconomic group? Because they'll be the first folks that's going to have to, face the problem. So I just like to understand how will that actually happen? Not so much about the developing countries, because they're going to be taken care of by the United Nations and its agencies and various philanthropic system, but countries that are in the developed countries that don't actually have a universal health system, they might be in deep trouble.
Yeah,
go ahead, Craig.
Yeah, I think it's really hard to predict. I think that this has to be coordinated at a higher level, meaning I think groups like WHO are crucial to and partnerships across other public health agencies are the same, are crucial to determine rational principles by which the initial doses of some of these first vaccines are provided, and it's not only among a particular country, it's within risk groups across countries, and it may have to be among areas where disease is transmitting the most at a particular time. And this probably will play out over a couple years. The first vaccines that will probably get used in some form or another will probably be unlicensed at the time and used through emergency use protocols. And that itself is really complicated because every country has a different regulatory framework around how products may be used under some sort of emergency use protocol. So it's going to require an unprecedented amount of global coordination and careful consideration with how we decide what goes where. I certainly don't want to have to make those decisions. So it's I think it's best that there be agreement across multiple parties because of the anticipated political challenges to that.
Okay, another question from Steve. Craig, I don't know if you can read it. It's about slack capacity, and the question is there value to just as manufacturers having always having extra capacity, and it can be, I guess, Stephen, you're asking, can it be switched out? Is it devoted to only a COVID-19 vaccine of a particular technology, or is there interchangeability in our building slack capacity?
Yeah, all the technologies are different. So that's one complex factor, and then the all across the chain of manufacturing from end to end, there are different parts that have different degree of interchangeability. For instance, there's the machine at the end that receives all the vaccine and puts it into vials. That could be a common piece of capital, but some of the earlier parts of the chain and the piece of capital can be very specific to the type of technology that's being made. And the idea that this is capital intensive, that there's actual physical machinery that needs to be built and made, is an important one to how this will stress the supply chain. So I think it will be really difficult. That's
yeah, it does seem
I don't
really
think
difficult.
We know what we're really building yet.
Yeah, it's going to be tough. Okay, time for one last question, and that's about getting that slack capacity to come in partnership with all the pharmaceutical companies around the world. Is that something that you can comment on?
I think to some degree that might happen. But again, it really depends on the technology and specifically what part of the process, what part of that process chain needs to be used. So different companies have different expertise in different types of manufacturing, and I think it wouldn't be surprising, and we already see a whole lot of partnerships taking place in the private sector across like a smaller company and a larger company, or academic groups and larger companies, to try to marry the particular technology with the particular company that happens to have the physical machinery to manufacture that particular technology. So I think to some extent that is happening, but as we get closer to knowing exactly which types of vaccines are having the best effect, then there might be more discussions going from one company to another, and possibly even through intervention of intermediaries in trying to marry the specific technology in the lead with the companies that have the most capacity to make it. But it's a slow process. It takes a while to move a technology from one company to another, and there are a lot of regulatory requirements to show that, you know, if it's midway through the process, the equivalence of one product and another, because they are biologics.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. We're at the end of time, and I wanted just to thank Craig and to thank Merck for allowing Craig to speak to us. You really have all of our wishes and hopes resting on you and the pharmaceutical industry and R&D and all the bench science that's going to go into producing this vaccine. This will be recorded, so please tell your friends that this was a great webinar, and we will be probably producing this and posting it within the next couple of weeks. So stay tuned to the iHEA newsletter for more, and stay tuned to the immunizationeconomics.org, because we will be having more webinars designed by you as the months go by. So I'll be closing now, and thank you very much.
Great, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Craig.